Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Do you remember when football players wore stickum? Do you remember when the NBA played defense? Do you remember when Wrigley Field turned on the lights? If so, then this podcast is for you. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together. We're here to discuss iconic sports moments, teams, and athletes from our generation. This is GenX Classic Sports, sports talk for Gen Xers by Gen Xers.
All right, so welcome to the show. I don't know what episode number this is going to be. We'll put that in there later. And today's guest is my buddy Jim Ham. Jim, tell us where you grew up.
All right, well, I was born in Chicago, and I want to say in the fifth grade probably we moved to a suburb, Brookfield, which is fairly close in near the Eisenhower Expressway, which runs right into downtown, actually runs under the main post office.
I prepared some notes for you, Jim, because I know how the Cubs are for you, and like I told you, a bunch of little boys down in South Arkansas started rooting for the Cubs in the early 80s. So I just kind of did a little research because what I want to build up to is talking about the 84 team. I know the World Series is a big deal, and we'll get back together sometime and maybe talk about that. But let me just give you a little Cubs history that you may or may not know, and I did a lot of research. So the Cubs started in 1876. Did you know that? That's way back there, dude.
Way back. Yeah.
I don't even know if they were called the Cubs at that point, but the internet says they started as a franchise in 1876. Now, this lovable losers thing that they got tagged with, let me give you some history on that. In 1885, they actually tied in the World Series 3-3-1. Go figure. In 1886, they lost the World Series 4-2. Then they went back in 1906 and lost 4-2. And by the way, a tied baseball game. I've already mentioned one tie. In 1907, they won the World Series with a 4-0-1 record. Run out of daylight. I don't know how that happens.
I do remember at Wrigley Field, if it got too late, they would finish the game the next day if they were playing. Because this is a classic Cub quote. I went to see a game and they lost twice in the same day.
I love that. 1908, they went back to the World Series and won it again. They went back to back in 07 and 08. 1910, they lost 4-1. 1918, there's a reason for this. In 1918, they lost 4-2. 1929, they lost. 1932, they lost 4-0. 1935, they lost 4-2. 1938, they lost 4-0. And in 1945, you know why that's significant. They lost the World Series 4-3. And that was their last postseason appearance until when?
1984. And that's the thing. I did know, not those statistics, but that they actually were really good back in the day. But that's just so far back in history that we don't.
Absolutely. I mean, you're talking 80 years ago and beyond, even for a fan of the 80s. I'm going to switch into 1984 because there's a fascinating story about leading up to some things about 1984. The first thing that you need to know is that in 1982, now this is almost exactly when we got cable vision. I'm going to say it was a year after we got cable. So what our routine was, the Cubs would play at 1:15 or whatever, and we would go out a home game on WGN. We would go wait on it to finish 4 o'clock or whatever, 3:34, and we would go out and play our Sandlot after that. So we couldn't get started until David saw whether the Cubs won or lost or not, because he was the biggest fan of all of us. But leading into 84, in 82, the Cubs lost 89 games. And in 83, they lost 91 games. Okay, there was no reason to think that 1984 would really be any different. They were on a awful, awful streak, right? I think Ryne Sandberg had started playing a little at 82, somewhere in there, 81, 82, had played a little bit. Sandberg, but here's what I found out, and I'm going to give credit to some of these guys I got these articles from and some of this information. So in 84, when they go into spring training, there's no reason at all to think anything was going to be any different than the 91 and 89 losses they'd had the 2 years before that. And here, by the way, General manager was a guy named Dallas Green,
I remember.
and the manager was Jim Fry. Remember? Okay. So in 1984, and I don't remember, were they out in Arizona for spring training back then? I really can't remember. Yeah, they could have been in Arizona.
I'm pretty sure they've always been out there since that I remember.
So this is how things have changed over the years to me. So in spring training, which they would tell you nowadays, those games mean zilch, right? Most likely pros now wouldn't care. But in spring training of 84, the Cubs went on an 11-game losing streak in spring training. And I don't know how many games they played, probably 20, 25. That's a lot of games. That's half their games probably that they lost in a row during spring training. So apparently the guys in charge, the managers or the manager and the general manager, they got together and they made 4 big decisions that changed everything for that season. And I found these, and I'm going to tell you what these are. 4 big things happened that are the catalyst for bigger and better things later that season. The spring training losing streak caused GM Dallas Green to make a trade with Philly. Do you happen to remember who he might have traded for just before the season started by any chance? Because I didn't know this. I had to find out this way.
Was it Rick Sutcliffe?
Not
He
yet.
came later.
Not yet. He made a trade for Gary Matthews and Bob Dernier from Philly. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about that is the Cubs fans apparently didn't even bat an eye because this didn't exactly move the needle for fans. And in fact, the media said that Matthews, he was already considered past his prime. And Bob Dernier, at that point, his reputation was that he was a good center fielder with great speed, but he couldn't hit. That was kind of his overall profile. Okay, and when I read that about both of them, I thought, really? Okay, well, now we know how they pulled it off, I guess. These guys weren't that well thought of, apparently. And I want to say that Dallas Green or Jim Fry one had been with the Phillies before, and so they had a lot of knowledge about the roster.
I think that's where they got Ryne Sandberg.
In a trade or something from the...
Yeah, before that.
Okay.
I think they did.
All right, and speaking of Sandberg, the second big thing the Cubs did was the manager Jim Fry took a real special attention to Sandberg's hitting. And apparently Sandberg, up until this point, he was young. He'd only been in the league 2 or 3 years. I think this might have been his 3rd or 4th. He was kind of known as a slap hitter, not a power hitter at all, which, you know, if you think about your stereotypical second baseman back then, okay, he doesn't hit home runs. That's pretty typical. But Fry apparently took a real interest in his hitting and worked with him a lot on hitting with more power. That was just the big thing they worked on, I guess, in the off season or in spring training, probably spring training, because back then probably didn't get together in the off season. But he really focused on having Sandberg hit for power, and we'll talk about how that paid off later. And the other 2 things, that were there was a particular couple of games, and they were sort of folded into the Rick Sutcliffe trade. Rick Sutcliffe came over from Cleveland, I believe, and when he got there, 2 big things happened. The Ryne Sandberg game, as people call it now, and the Rick Sutcliffe game, as people call it now. And I want to talk about those for a minute. Do you remember either one of those by any chance?
No, I don't think so.
I think you will when I mention them. The articles I found just referred them to that because it's just easier. So think about it. So the Cubs, kind of out of nowhere, I guess because of all the Rick Sutcliffe had, I think he was only 2-3, I think, with the Indians. I don't know, what about him made them want to get him so bad, but they get him, and between that and these other things I'm going to mention, totally turned their season around. So by the time June rolled around, the Cubs were doing pretty well. I'm sure no one thought it would last. But let me tell you quickly about the Ryne Sandberg game, and you chime in because I know you remember this. On June 23rd, 1984, the Cubs played that game of the week on NBC. It was the only game they had played, and it was something like 40 years it was not on WGN. It was 40. That goes back to the early, but it was almost the first ever game outside of WGN that was nationally televised for them. But it was on NBC, and it was a big deal. June 23rd, 1984, they were playing at Wrigley, and they were playing, of all people, the St. Louis Cardinals. Okay, so the Cubs trailed the Cards 9-3 in the 6th inning. But in the 6th, The Cubs somehow got 5 runs, and they made it 9-8, okay? So in the 9th inning, Sandberg has a homer, comes to the plate, has a homer, and he ties the game at 9-9. And, of course, everybody knows how bad the Cubs and Cardinals hate each other.
Yeah.
So he ties it up in the 9th, bottom of the 9th, 9-9. They go into the 10th. The Cardinals get 2 runs, if I'm not mistaken, off of Lee Smith, which is unusual, but they get 2 runs. They go up 11-9. And in the bottom of the 10th, 2 outs, Sandberg gets up and homers again and ties the game 11-11. You probably remember now. And then in the bottom of the 11th, the Cubs scored. It wasn't Sandberg, but they scored with a substitute. I think they said that they won the game 12-11. Now, what's significant about it is that a national TV audience saw Ryne Sandberg go completely off. And there's YouTube videos to this day that just are called the Ryne Sandberg game. You need to look it up.
Yeah.
So for the day, this guy that was a slap hitter, supposedly, he was 5 for 6 with 7 RBI and 2 home runs. And, of course, they were daggers, both of them. They kept them, he kept them alive both times. And so I'm assuming that was a Saturday game. They probably played a Friday, Saturday, Sunday series, and so that would have probably been a national Saturday telecast. So he gets 5 hits, 2 home runs, totally dramatic, right? And there was a footnote to that game because, by the way, the Cubs, I don't think they were in first place yet, but they needed these wins, apparently. A footnote to that is, if you'll remember, the center fielder for the Cardinals for a long time was Willie McGee. Remember him?
Yeah.
Great player.
Yeah.
Willie McGee hit for the cycle that day. Well, he's the reason the Cardinals scored 11 runs. He hit for the cycle. And if I'm not mistaken, he's the last person to ever do that for an opponent at Wrigley Field. I don't think it's been done since. Wow. So, huge win. Later on, Ryne Sandberg that season was named the National League MVP. He batted .314. He had 200 hits that year, which used to be a big milestone, man. 200 hits was a big season. He had 19 home runs. I think he had 3 or 4 the year before. Now he's got, and this is in the days for people listening that don't remember. 20 home runs was a pretty big deal in the 80s. It really was. I mean, nobody was hitting 40 and 50 home runs, really. So he had 19 home runs. He had 84 RBI. Now, this is a second baseman. All of those numbers were career highs. So whatever extra work they did in the spring training on, and he was a big guy. He looked like, to me, I don't know how big he really is, but I always thought for a second baseman he was a decent sized guy. So he finally kind of found his groove hitting, obviously, and went all the way to getting a National League MVP.
Didn't he just go into the Hall? I want to say I remember seeing. Maybe I
know Sutcliffe is in the Hall. Surely Sandberg's in there. I don't know when it was. I should have looked that up, I guess. But do you remember that game, kind of the drama around that? Since it was
specifically, I'm sure if it was a Saturday game, unless I was doing something, I would have.
Well, and the big deal was because it was on a national audience, and I don't know who the announcers were. It was on NBC. It might have been Costas or somebody. I'm not really sure, but apparently it really shined a bright light on the Cubs because they were surging. They'd been terrible for so many years, no postseason since 1945, and then they were surging. Not only that, I don't know who scheduled this, but they were brilliant. They hated the Cardinals. I think the Cardinals had Whitey Herzog as manager back then, I'm sure. And they hated each other, of course. And this was high drama, basically. This was a well-scheduled game for a Saturday afternoon. So I'd always heard about the Sandberg game. I've seen the highlights of it. Very dramatic. And I had also always heard of the Rick Sutcliffe game. Have you heard of the Rick Sutcliffe game?
I don't think so.
Okay. So that's fine. What I did not know was that the Rick Sutcliffe game happened the very next day, June 24th, 1984. And I have heard of this game, and I didn't know the deal around it. But let me give you, so the Cubs come off this dramatic win. They come back the next day, and Sutcliffe, who had just been traded, had only started one game for the Cubs, and it was on the road.
Yeah, I knew they got him late in the season.
Yeah, so they get him in mid-June. He makes one start, and I don't even know if he won that start or had a decision at all or whatever. He was like 2 wins, 3 losses or something with Cleveland before that, something to that effect. So I don't know what anybody really expected, but he comes to Wrigley Field, and the next day, I think it was a Sunday, and of course, that would have probably been back to a WGN audience. But this was his second start for the Cubs, the home field. I'm sure it was packed. And he turned in maybe the performance of his career, actually. So Sutcliffe plays against the Cards that day he has 14 strikeouts, and that's the most a Cub had since Fergie Jenkins in 1971.
Wow.
And Sutcliffe, he was the man. The Cubs won that day 4-0, and they swept the Cardinals. So I'm assuming they did a Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Yeah.
And they swept them 3-0 for the first time since 1978. Okay, so that was a big deal, obviously. And the Cardinals were stacked. Was it 82 that they won the World Series, maybe? Something like that? I can't remember.
Yeah.
But I know they were that speed team.
They had Ozzie Smith, and they just pound that ball into the AstroTurf and run.
I don't know if Vince Coleman was with them yet or not, but he was. If not, he was shortly to come on board. But Willie McGee could fly for sure.
Yeah.
They had quite a lineup. And so the Cubs won. They swept the Cardinals. Huge deal. Really big deal. And so those two games plus those decisions that sort of led into all this drama with Sutcliffe and Sandberg hitting differently and all this. And by the way, the Sarge, Gary Matthews being traded and Dernier. Sutcliffe finished that season 16-1, okay? And he had a 2.69 ERA, and he won the 1984 Cy Young Award. I don't know how many teams have ever traded for a guy in June and had him win a Cy Young. Maybe it's never happened any other time. But so that really, for whatever reason, emotionally and kind of gelling as a team and getting a new pitcher and all that really propelled the Cubs to 96 wins that year. They almost had that many losses the year before. So they won 96 games that year. And that led to the epic playoff, I'll call it, with the Padres in the postseason. So do you have any, and I've got notes about the Padres series right here, but I'll take a break a minute and let you talk. Do you kind of, are you with me on sort of the drama around that season at all at this point? Do you remember some of that?
Yeah, and I think, like you said, you're watching all of that, and as a Cub fan, you're wondering when the other shoe's going to drop, and of course it finally did. And I do remember watching every game of the playoffs, which it's ironic. The next year they went to 7 games, and of course they lost in 5. And on a personal note, you'll get a kick out of this.
I think you've told me this before. Go ahead. I love this story if it's what I'm thinking.
I dropped my first F-bomb in front of Ann.
That's exactly what you told me.
When the ball went through Leon Durham's legs in Game 5.
Well, let's set this up a little. You were living in North Arkansas?
No, I was in yes, I was living in Mountain Home, and she had a house in town, so she had cable.
She had cable, and you were there. You've told me this several, and you were there to watch the game, obviously, to bum off her cable for sure. And y'all hadn't, I don't know how long you'd been dating, but
you're still in that period where you're
trying to be on your best behavior.
You're trying not to go there. And I just remembered when that happened, it was in Game 5, and now you really had that feeling, here we go. And I think I dropped the F-bomb as F an error and went and sat on the back porch till I cooled down a little bit. And her son came home, David, a little bit later, and I heard her in the kitchen. She said, "You probably shouldn't say anything to Jim about the Cubs, because I think he's upset."
And for those who have no way of knowing, Ann's sitting in the other room, so it worked out okay for him. But she might have been thinking for 5 or 10 minutes, what kind of maniac with this dude here, man? You've told me that before, and it's hysterical because, once again, if not for WGN, man, you'd be listening to that on the radio somehow. You probably didn't even have a chance to hear it on the radio.
And I was trying to think of that. I don't know, because if it was a playoff game, if it might have been on a network. And, I think I was over there to eat dinner that night. But
the other guys and I have talked about that, and we all agreed that we've probably listened to more games on the radio since the internet was born than we ever did before back in the day. We just don't remember as a group ever listening. I mean, obviously the Razorback football and basketball games are on the radio. None of us can remember hearing Major League Baseball on the radio where we grew up. Now, we know, obviously, Jack Buck and Harry Carey and whoever were doing their thing, but we just had Harry Carey and Steve Stone, right?
Yeah.
On WGN. And And so I don't know if you could have heard it or not, honestly. You may not have had a chance any other way to watch this series. So let's talk about this series. Like you said, if I was a Cubs, I mean, I do remember this series. My two best friends had just graduated high school, and we were all kind of interested in what was going on with this. They were probably working summer jobs and stuff, but we were keeping up with this the best we could. Let me give you some names. I looked at the box score, not every game, but a typical box score from that series, so people can hear the guys we're talking about. So Bob Dernier was playing center field for the Cubs. Ryne Sandberg, of course, was playing second base. Gary Matthews, the Sarge, was playing left field. And he had a cult following in those left field bleachers.
I remember the Sarge business.
The Sarge, people loved the Sarge. Leon Durham played first base, the guy that let a ball go
Bull
by.
Durham.
Bull Durham. Keith Moreland was playing right field some for them.
Yeah.
Ron Say was playing third base.
What was his nickname?
The Penguin, right?
That's the way he walked.
He looked like it, yeah. Jody Davis was the typical catcher, but there was a backup named Steve Lake that might have caught a certain pitcher. By the way, speaking of pitchers, before I finish this, if I'm not mistaken, Dennis Eckersley was also in their rotation that year as a pitcher.
Was he?
I think he was.
Did he? I remember that name.
I think he was, because it says Game 3 lost Dennis Eckersley. So
yeah, because they lost game. They won the first two.
Yeah, he was like probably not their stud. Obviously Sutcliffe was, but yeah, that's interesting. And then shortstop was Larry Boa.
Oh,
you remember? And Sutcliffe, of course, was their main pitcher. Now, I'm going to go ahead and mention the Padres names, because there's some interesting.
Steve Garvey was on that team.
Absolutely. So a guy named Alan Wiggins played second base for them. A guy you may have heard of named Tony Gwynn played right field for them. Pretty young Tony Gwynn at that point, I would say. Steve Garvey had moved to first base kind of on the end of his career. He was probably getting to the end of his career. But he was, well, maybe. I don't know. What was he, a mid-70s to maybe mid-80s kind of guy? Anyway, Garvey. Greg Nettles was playing third base. Remember him?
Yeah, I remember that name.
There was a catcher named Terry Kennedy that doesn't ring a bell with me at all, but here you go, Arkansas Connect. All roads lead through Arkansas in sports. Kevin McReynolds was playing center field that series.
I remember that name.
And Kevin McReynolds was obviously a fantastic baseball player. And another name that people will remember, Gary Templeton, was playing shortstop for them. Yeah, and so that was kind of the group of guys that were going at it in this series. So there's some Hall of Famers and some big names in that list. So, okay, so the game one of that series was October the 2nd. And you probably remember the Cubs had a big win, right? It was at Wrigley Field. Cubs were hosting. It was 13-0.
Yeah, I looked the games up today because I couldn't remember specifics. And
Rick Sutcliffe won that one. So I remember all of us guys thinking, like you said, this probably is not. There's got to be. This is too much luck for the Cubs. I'm sure the whole country was thinking that. So October 3rd, Game 2. At Wrigley Field, Cubs win 4-2, and the winning pitcher was Steve Trout, which I've heard. I know Steve.
That name.
Yeah, I guess he was maybe their second or third guy, and Eckersley was the other. Lee Smith had the save. So, I mean, you can set the table for this if you want. So the Cubs have played back-to-back days. They've got 17 runs, and the Padres have had 2 at this point, and they're winning 2-0. So then they have to go to San Diego, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think based on their records or something, all 3 games were in San Diego, right?
Here's what's crazy. The next 3 in a row were in San Diego. And what's really crazy that would never happen now, they played October 2nd and October 3rd in Wrigley. They played October 4th in San Diego. That would never happen now. They did not play October 5th. And then they played the 6th and the 7th. So I'm giving something away, but it's a 5-game series. I think you've already said they moved to 7
the year after.
The year, of course they did.
Yeah.
So they go out there, and what happens in Game 3, Jim? Do you kind of remember?
Well, what I mostly remember is the error. I know, looking at the score today, they were in the game up until I think the very end. I think I think maybe Lee Smith blew a save or something.
Well, there was some of that going on in those last 3 games for sure. Game 3 specifically out there, the Padres won 7-1, and I didn't write down who the Padres pitcher was, but Eckersley took the loss for the Cubs. Now, I don't know if that means I don't know what that means. I don't know if he was. I assume he was the starter with a score like that, but I don't know. So now, if you're a Cubs fan, you're up 2-1, thinking, "Uh-oh." And then they get a day off, and that doesn't help anybody probably, because October 6th, Game 4, remember, 5-game series, Game 4, the Padres hosting, they won 7-5. I think that is your error, one of your error field game. I don't think they did really. Lee Smith took the loss in that.
Yeah, the Leon Durham thing was Game 5.
Okay.
I did look that up because I couldn't remember which
all right,
game.
so that was the deciding game. Okay. Lee Smith took the loss in that, so that means since he's a reliever, there was some back and forth scoring. I didn't look into the specifics of each one of these, but 7-5. That's giving up a lot of runs. And then they play the very next day. It's 2-2 now. They play the very next day, Game 5 at which is a weird deal, by the way. 2 games and then 3 in a row. That's a huge advantage to host 3 out of the 5. So they go Game 5. The Padres won 6-3. That we just discovered was the Leon Durham. You said ground ball error at first.
Either went just past him, or I think it went through his legs.
I kind of vaguely remember that.
It was ugly.
It was a 6-3 game, and what's stunning about that is that Rick Sutcliffe took the loss in that one. So that means they had some back and forth a lot in that game.
Yeah, and I think when I was looking at it, they said that he had like beaten them every game that year but one.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like the second time he lost to them.
Exactly. It's not the second time he lost to anyone in the National League that year. And then just as a footnote in history kind of name that jumped out at me, the save in that deciding game was Goose Gossage for the Padres. Rick, I didn't remember him being with them. Some of these things I remember, and some of them I'm like, he played for whoever played for them. But yeah, Rick Gossage. So as a Cubs fan who was a grown man at that point, I mean, I was kind of a punk kid at that time, and I remember how devastating it was. But how was it for you, Jim? You couldn't have taken that very well at all.
No, I mean, again, and it's just that whole mindset, here it is again. What was it, 69, when they had the epic collapse? I think that's when the Mets won the World Series. And so, and then you got the Bartman ball.
The Bartman, oh my, yeah.
And of course, the article I was looking at about the game brought up the Billy Goat, and I'm sure you've heard of that.
I've read that story several times. Sure, the Billy Goat thing.
And I've actually had a cheeseburger at the Billy Goat Inn.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm glad to hear that. I was going to ask you.
It's weird. It's a lower Whacker Drive is actually underside underneath Chicago, and the Trib and the Sun Times, that's where their trucks would load up the papers.
Right
and
in
it was right there on Lower Whacker Drive.
I've stood right
I think
there.
in the Blues Brothers they go on Lower Whacker Drive.
I think so.
But yeah, it was just another, and that's, I'll be honest with you, Game 7 of the 16 series, I went to bed when he made 2 horrible pitching changes.
Yeah.
And they either tied it or went ahead. And, of course, there was a rain delay. And I was just like, I can't bear it. I can't bear it,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I understand. I mean, at that point, you had, the Red Sox and the Cubs at different points were known for their curses, so to speak. And it was pretty bad.
Speaking of the Red Sox, another former Cub, you remember, I think it was against the Mets, Bill Buckner.
Oh, yeah.
Let the ball go through his legs.
I guess the curse traveled with some people. So let's talk for a minute, kind of our last thing. We definitely can get back together and talk about a lot of stuff, but maybe we can talk World Series victory the next time since this is negative. But 84 was just such a magical year in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, it didn't end well. I might even split this into 2 episodes, but can you talk a little bit about the Steve Goodman thing that we've kind of been talking about through email for For the ones who don't know, and Jim told me this years ago, and I've always kind of found it interesting. I'll let you tell about, you met him, right?
Yes.
But I just want to just introduce it by saying Jim and I a long time ago talked about this, but there was a Cubs fan who was also a songwriter. And Jim saw him at a ball game. But Jim, tell us about Steve Goodman, a little bit about his some of the songs. I know there's 3 of his songs really significant, but can you talk about that for just a second? We'll end with that one because that's a great story.
Well, when I got out of the Army, so I got out in '70, and I was back home and actually working with my dad at this hotel that was at the O'Hare Airport. But anyway, at some point he had a friend, and he had box seats, second row, Cubs warm-up circle. And he's like, hey, do you want tickets for the game? Wow. And so I'm like, yeah. And so, it was way down, right on the field practically. And when the game's over, I'm just kind of sitting there waiting for the crowd to thin out. And I look over, and there's Steve Goodman. And I had just seen him like recently at like a college gig. And he was one of those people that was a well-renowned and respected songwriter who never really had any hits for himself.
Yeah.
And Chicago had a huge folk scene down in around Wrigleyville there.
Yeah, right.
There
That's
was
the
another
artsy part of town.
Another guy named John Prine who was another great songwriter. Steve Goodman wrote a song called "The City in New Orleans," which was recorded by Arlo Guthrie and Willie Nelson.
Yeah.
And probably his best known song is "You Never Call Me by My Name" by David Allan Coe.
Yeah.
Well, and I've got Steve Goodman's version. Well, at the end of his lyrics, David Allan Coe says, well, this my friend Steve Goodman, and this is right on the record. He said, told me this was a perfect.
That's the version song. I grew up hearing always. Yeah.
He says, but they have nothing about mothers and trucks.
Dogs, maybe. Prison.
And so I was drunk the day my mom mom got out of prison. And
so it's that guy.
And so not exactly a household name, but it was a big deal to me. I've got a lot of his music, and I think I sent you a link. There's a Cubs fan dying request that's hilarious.
Yes, he wrote almost a parody song of Cubs fans' dying request. And by the way, I read that did not make the general manager very happy at all when he heard about that.
Yeah, I think, and again, Cubs. I think the time I saw him, he was wearing a Cubs hat, but he did do a song called "Go Cubs Go," and WGN used it at some point.
They played it at the end of every game, I think, on the credits or something. They played it for years. I don't know how long they played it, but
I don't know if you remember this, but in the '80s, when I was living in Mountain Home, and when I'd be at Ann's house watching a game or whatever, their lead-in music was "Jump" by Van Halen.
Oh, wow. I don't remember that. That's crazy. You'd think I would remember that. That's in my wheelhouse.
It might have been earlier than '84, but I remember
Well, Goodman, so it's fair to say, obviously he's very talented, but he was also a long-suffering Chicago Cubs fan. And so he writes one song that's kind of lamenting all their bad luck, and then he writes "Go Cubs Go," which is their fight song, anthem, whatever you want to call it, that really gets everybody going in there when they would play that. And you saw him, right? I don't know if you got to that part yet, but sorry, but you saw him at the game.
He did like a junior college or something. When I went to school up there, I went to a junior college out in the DuPage County, which is the next one over from Cook, which is where Chicago and Brookfield is. And he was doing with another folk singer named Bonnie Kolak. And it's funny, when I told him I had just seen him a couple weeks or whatever, first thing he said was, "Man, Bonnie was really good that night, wasn't she?"
What a nice guy.
He was really a cool guy. We talked and shook hands and everything. And
well, that's cool that folks who haven't seen it, you can just look up Steve Goodman Cubs on YouTube, and you can find the Cub fans' dying wish. Is that last request? And then you can find "Go Cubs Go." You can find all of his stuff, but he also has almost like a Austin City Limits performance where he does the David Allan Coe type. It's not exactly the same, but he does do that song, "You Never Call Me by My Name," and some other stuff. So talented guy, actually.
Barry, and we lost him early too, of some kind of cancer. I don't remember how old he was.
He had leukemia, and he died, I want to say, it's really sad. It was like 4 days before the series against the Padres or something in '84. Does that sound right? Yeah. I want to say it was right before they played the Padres. So anyway, I wanted you to tell that because I always thought that was cool. And, songwriter is not going to be noticed in public if he's not just out there as a performer as well. So for you to even recognize him probably was, tickled him, honestly. But yeah, he died of leukemia. He was, I guess he was in his early 40s, maybe, very early 40s.
Right.
Yeah. I saw the video of him singing that one, and I'm like, he's not very old. So I want to say he was in his early 40s. But yeah, that's a great story that you recognized. I'm sure he appreciated it. I really do. But yeah, that "Go Cubs Go" that's their song, man. That's.
I think when I got up on the morning after the 2016 Game 7, I popped that in the CD player. I had a copy of that.
Absolutely. That gets them going in the stadium. Thank you, Jim. I'm going to end the episode here.
Thank you for having me, man. I enjoyed it.
Been great, dude. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.